We want to welcome everybody who has returned to our lecture series on the censorship of Hebraica and Judaica books. In our first lecture, we spoke about internal censorship of Rambam Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, Sefer Mara Nevuchim. In the second lecture, we focused on the reverence, love, and cherishing of Jewish texts and why Jewish enemies have identified that lifeblood and that vitality of the Jewish people, which is learning, which is often transmitted through teachers as texts and written texts, either manuscript or printed text, as a way of eradicating the Jewish people themselves. In this third lecture, we're going to chronologically go from the late Renaissance up to the Nazi book burnings. However, before I do that, I want to share with you something from art history. The subject of rabbinic portraiture is an interest of mine, and this is a wonderful little pamphlet called The Jewish Face by Miriam L. Elias, and not unaccidentally, she represents medieval rabbis who later painters represented in painting, and she includes photographs later when that became available technologically, always with books in the back, or at least 90% of the time. So here we have Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi. Notice the tomes of his manuscripts in the back. Here we have Rashi. Notice he's hovered over a sefer. Here we have Rabbi Yaakov Bar Meir. Look at his reverence for cuddling and cradling that text. And here we have the Ramban, Nachmanides, who Rabbi Weisblum, who I want to shout out and thank again for the invitation to return in this series on the history of the censorship of Hebrew books. Again, look at the reverence this painter has represented in the Ramban's cherishing of this text in front of him, represented in the painting. You see that there are tomes in his background, and 90% of the photos and paintings in this little book are all of rabbis with books somewhere in the portraiture. So here we have the Shabtai HaKohen, known as the Shach. What's in front of him? A book. And his reverence for that text. And here we have the Gra, who in my second lecture I noted compared the 62 tractates of the Talmud to 62 queens and all the myriads of other rabbinic works to the maidens who served the queen. Well, what's in front of this painter's representation of the Gra is a text and a pen. The pen is a little ironic because the Gra didn't publish in his lifetime. It was people after him who brought his works to light. Rabbi Moshe HaSofer, Chatam Sofer, look at his cherishing and love and reverence for that text. The artist who painted this is extraordinary because they really captured that spirit of the reverence for text. And in the interest of time, here we have the photographs in the back of the book. Here's Rabbi Meir Shapira, and what is he holding but a Sefer Torah with great reverence and awe. And here's my favorite photograph, Rabbi Avraham Alter, the Ger Rebbe, Rabbi Avraham Mordecai Alter. I believe Alita, who we're thanking for orchestrating the technological aspects of this recording, will show this in a more visually virtuosic presentation. This, when I grew up in my little high school environment and elementary school, this was the picture I kept over my bed. And I come from, on my mother's side, a Chabad dynasty, but I kept the Ger Rebbe's picture because, notice this photograph of Rabbi Avraham Alter. He is cherishing a text. It looks like a siddur. It's a very small text. But the photograph, which is different than a portraiture, really, I believe, conveys the reverence, love, and cherishing of text in a way that the present generation, unfortunately, with social media and other technological glitz, don't have an appreciation for. We live in an era where people just want images like caveman paintings, and the Jewish people are from a tradition of text, oral and written, and I hope these lectures give a sense of that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyeh b'davaro.
Amen.
With each bracha it is thought from the Mekubalim and Sfat, some sort of tikkun is affected theurgically. And that's the reason why David HaMelech, when he found that there was a plague, an epidemic, maybe related to COVID in some ways, at least as a disease, made 100 blessings a day because he wanted to counteract the people that were dying, and he thought by instituting that everybody recite at least 100 brachot a day, that would help theurgically stay the tide of the disease, the epidemic that was experienced. So I wanted to open this lecture, even though historically it's from the late Renaissance to the Nazi book burnings or censorship, to a passage in Sefer Eov. In my first lecture on the internal censorship of Rambam's Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, I noted that I consider the Sefer Eov one of the greatest texts ever written, particularly chapter 38, where Hashem shows up out of the whirlwind and says, "Do you know all these secrets of science, meteorology, bird migration, plate tectonics, geology, oceanography?" And Eov is dumbfounded and says, "No, I really don't know all the secrets that those scientists have explored over millennium by asking the question what and how." Religion asks the question why, as does philosophy. So I want to bring another very powerful passage in Eov. That one of the reasons Sefer Eov has made such an impact on me, and I consider one of the greatest texts ever written, is that it raises the question of theodicy, which was the subject of my doctoral dissertation. Really, the original draft had the first chapter a reading of Sefer Eov, and the last chapter was on Sefer Eov, so it came full circle. Because it raises the question how somebody who is basically decent, maybe not a tzaddik, Rambam, as we mentioned before, says he was serving on a madrega of Yira only, he had to be brought over to serve on a madrega of Ahava. Rav Sajik Owen cites the Gemara, a different reason why Eov underwent the test, because he was silent in Paro's court when they were deciding to drown the Hebrew boys, raises the question of theodicy. And I could extrapolate quite a bit on this. The original draft of the dissertation had sections on suffering in Jewish history and catastrophe and so forth, and how rabbis have grappled and wrestled with why sometimes bad things happen to good people. And so Sefer Eov was the keystone of my original draft, and I came to really appreciate this work as the greatest work ever written in theodicy. I looked at Megillas Esther as well in the original draft, where it says that Mordecai was a Gilgul of Yaakov, because Mordecai lo yishtakabeh livnei Rasha, Haman yamak shemo, and Yaakov bowed before Esav. But I want to share with you not only chapter 38 that I did in the first lecture, but here chapter 19, just a snippet again. Eov says, "Oh, that my words were now written in text. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that with an iron pen and lead they were graven in the rock forever. But as for me, I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he will witness at the last upon the dust. And when after my skin this is destroyed, then without my flesh shall I see Hashem, whom I, even I, shall see for myself. And mine eyes shall behold, and not another's. My reins are consumed within me." If we say, how we will persecute him, seeing that the root of the matter is found in me, be ye afraid of the sword? For wrath bringeth the punishment of the sword, that ye may know there is a God of judgment. This is the greatest work in theodicy perhaps ever written, and any work in theodicy, whether from a historical perspective or a textual basis of rabbinic texts, definitely has to understand the secrets and depths of this major work. But the reason I cited this passage in 19, little snippet, Mi yitain apo, vayikadavun milai, Mi yitain besefer, v'yichuku. Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. This lectureship on the censorship of Hebrew books is about things that are written down that are censored. And if I might mention, Heinrich Heine again referred to the Jewish books as the Jews' portable homeland. Grossman himself, as a modern Israeli, has likened that metaphor. For the Jews have found surcease from their sorrows and persecutions in the exile, and resilience and strength to survive from learning Hebrew books. This is attested in a text by Rabbi Yosef Tumin in his introduction to his book Perei Megodim, which quotes from a letter sent to him by a Jew named Levy, the poor Hebrew teacher. When I wake up during the long cold winter nights and my wife weeps because there is no bread for the children, and my mind is filled with agonizing thoughts, it is then that I sit down and open a book, and to learn. The book then becomes my city of refuge, and my bastion of courage, my portable homeland. I cite the sources, as I mentioned in the second lecture, in a number of my recently published books, which include chapters on all sorts of censorship and all different time periods of Judaism. One of the great book lovers, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, had a grandfather who had an outstanding library. And Agnon himself was a collector of Sfarim and learned them very well. He recalls his grandfather's library in Eastern Europe and writes repeatedly about the sanctity and saving power of the Jewish book. So in Kitbei Chaim Nachman Bialik, you also found a reverence for books, and particularly on Shas al Beit Zakini of Agnon, a return to Agnon, who, by the way, there was a fire and he even risked his life to go save his books. In Agnon's story, in the Heart of the Seas, which I was actually in a class with Gershon Shaked on, and Gershon Shaked was the greatest expounder of Hebrew literature from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Well, in this book, Agnon tells of Rabbi Hanania, who went on a hazardous journey by sea in the land of Israel when a storm broke out. The rabbi saw someone sitting on the deck of the ship, calmly learning a sefer. The rabbi's fears vanished immediately, for he knew that no tempest at sea would cause him to sink, and no beast of the deep could swallow him up, protected by the power of holy meditation of a rabbi on a sefer. Agnon commented on this literary work, noting that this section was written to re-emphasize that, quote, the Jewish people will survive the brutal and wild storms of history if only they would hold fast to the Jewish book, the anchor and compass of their redemption. I cite the sources of where I get these things in these books that came out recently, but it's absolutely remarkable. You know, another book lover, Gershom Scholem, he collected like over 400 editions of Sefer HaZohar. He had it in Latin. He had it in almost every language of the world. And he bequeathed this incredible library to the Jewish National University Library. And you can actually go visit and see his catalog, where he was working on a lexicon of Kabbalistic terms from Pulsa de Nora to Shiber Kelim, to all sorts of things that his students, including Isaiah Tishby, went on to later develop. Scholem cites the Baal Shem Tov, the Besht, that every sefer in one's house is like a spark of the divine, and that the person who gathers a library for their home is like gathering a palace for Hashem, because they are parts of Hashem himself. That's remarkable that the Besht would make a remark like that, and that a secular scholar of the history of Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, would bring that down. It shows, again, the reverence for books, even amongst a secular Jew who pioneered the field of the secular study of the historical history of Sifrei Kabbalah and Mekubalim. Not as an insider, but as an objective academic, had a great reverence for books. And as I hope to show you later in this presentation, from the late Renaissance to the Nazi book burnings and censorship, even a secular Jew who was friends with Sholem, like Gershom Walter Benjamin, had a great love for books. Walter Benjamin went through a horrible divorce, and at the end of it, he describes unpacking his library. And the reverence with which this secular Jew had for his books was enormous. One of his most prized collections was his collection of children's books. And this was from a serious German intellectual who experienced tremendous anti-Semitism. He wrote a work on Deutsches Trauerspiel, German tragedy, on German literature, that was rejected flat out for the crass anti-Semitism in the German university at the time of the Nazis. Something that Gratz earlier had experienced when he wrote his work, Geschichte der Juden, the history of the Jews. And I will cite Gratz. But let's bring it back to the importance of one's sparim and books that we find not only amongst rabbis and religious scholars, but amongst secular Jews. And really, for lovers of good books, one's library is something living and dynamic, the pride and joy of their lives, and importantly provides a sepulcher of wisdom that can open gates in heavenly worlds. Rabbi David Oppenheim, 1664 to 1736, of Prague, had a large collection that was acquired by the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which views these volumes, some of which were specially printed for Oppenheim on vellum and blue paper, as the glory of its larger collections. According to Menachem Schmelzer, at the time of Oppenheimer's major Judaica collections being in private hands, Schmelzer writes, quote, "There were Jewish communal libraries and collections at seminaries in Vienna, Berlin, Budapest, Paris, Krakow, Vilna, Warsaw, and elsewhere, and the library of Breslau Seminary was quite well known for its good collection of Hebrew manuscripts and printed books. In 1904, 18,000 printed books and 400 manuscripts were found in Breslau. Still, neither of these libraries matched the major Hebrew collections or could have aspired to rival those of the Bodleian and British Library Museum. Libraries of Jewish organizations and institutions could not and did not reach the level of Hebraica collection in royal, ecclesiastical, state, or university libraries in Europe. Historically, no public Jewish libraries existed in the 1700s. Hebrew books were owned by individuals and frequently significant private collections of Jewish patrons, which were acquired by non-Jewish libraries. Thus, two of the finest private collections, David Oppenheimer's and Hyman Michael's, were purchased in the 19th century by the Bodleian Library and by the British Museum. The important private collections of Abraham Merzelbacher was acquired by the City of the Library of Frankfurt, and that of David Kaufmann by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, both at the beginning of the 20th century. If you want my sources for these things, which are largely based on some archival work actually too, look at my collection of forthcoming books and books that have come out that include things on censorship. The most eloquent witness for the respect of the spiritual work is the foundation and maintenance of a library by countless lovers of books, Jewish lovers of books. A library provides not only nutrition to the spirit, but is a monument to the spirit where our ancestors are gathered. A library pictorially represents for us the ties of times where gray antiquity is intertwined with the bright present. The quote I just cited you was by Abraham Geiger, who was a representative of the Wissenschaft des Judentum Bewegung, the Science of Judaism movement. And he had a reverence for Jewish books too. And his statement that the libraries of Jewish texts are intertwined with the bright present and glimpses of the hope of the future show his love of books. During the 1890s, Jewish community leaders and members of the Association for Jewish History and Literature mandated establishment of Jewish libraries to preserve knowledge of the Jewish past. With the establishment of the Jewish public reading halls, Lesehallen, the number of Jewish libraries increased further. Lesehallen were founded, for example, in Berlin in 1894, Frankfurt am Main in 1905, Hamburg in 1909, and Posen in 1900. The Deutsches Israelitische Gemeinsamtbund, Masonic lodges, Jüdischen Vereinschaften, and Jewish societies often subsidized these Lesehallen located in primary urban centers. In the case of Frankfurt on the Main, a Masonic lodge sought to bring Jewish books to rural areas in the form of a mobile travel lending library, like the Chabad units today, which are more based on Emunah and B'tachon, but it was a portable library. The Montefiore Society, the Verein zur Abwehr der Antisemitismus, and other Jewish educational institutions sought to establish Jewish libraries. Often modest membership fees included borrowing privileges, but often the Jewish public could read Jewish books on premises if they did not check them out of the reading room. In the cases of scholarly merit, borrowing fees could be waived, as noted by Gershom Scholem, who only needed, this is a wonderful example Scholem brings down in his letters, that he had to provide a note from his mother before he could use the collection of the Jewish Community Council in Berlin. According to borrowing statistics and patron volume statistics, these libraries, for example, in Berlin, were used very heavily, often with standing room only, by Jews. Scholem attributes the incredible thirst of German Jews in search for their roots as a counter-reaction to the process of assimilation and acculturation that began with the Enlightenment, modern Enlightenment, that had begun en masse in the 1700s and 1800s as a result of political emancipation. Discussion of essential core collections accord regarding phenomena of Vereinsbibliothek, the phenomena of the home library, Jüdische Bibliothek, made possible by a relative greater ease of publishing and Jewish thirst for cultural roots as a backlash reaction among some assimilated Jews after having attained status in the host society as a result of emancipation and acculturation, gave rise to a number of house bibliothek. Even in the ghettos of the Nazis, the thirst for Jewish roots could be identified in some readers who frequented ghetto libraries. Some Jewish libraries, such as the one in the Nazi ghetto of Vilna, were allowed to function because German authorities felt they would be a useful distraction to ghetto residents. Let us go back to 1817. Rabbi Matthias Strasshun collected a magnificent library in Vilna, as did the Hebrew bibliographer Hermann Joseph Michael, 1792 to 1846, in Hamburg. Michael's collection is now in the British Museum in London. The great collections of Austrian scholar Solomon Halberstam, 1832 to 1900, was incorporated into the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. German Abraham Merchenbacher library later became a part of the Library of Frankfurt am Main, many of whose books the Nazis collected for a museum to the murdered Jewish race, and which ended up in the Offenbach Depot, before being sent to libraries throughout the Jewish world, as described by Scholem, who was sent by the Israeli government to the Offenbach Depot to bring back Hebrew books to the JNUL in Jerusalem. This is remarkable. I reviewed Scholem's letters, and he describes going to the Offenbach Depot, and nearby was Prague's cemetery, which is humongous, of Jews, and he actually wept in the cemetery. And he describes how the Israeli government sent him to basically bring back steamer trunks of sacred Jewish texts that had managed to survive with the Nazis' intent to have a museum to the murdered Jewish race filled with Judaica and Hebraica. And Scholem, actually, I believe in one of the letters, uses the metaphor of redeeming the captives. You know, everything was under auspices of, what do they call that? Whether it was permissible to take these books back to Jewish collections at Hebrew U, Jewish National University Library, or would they end up in the shelves of European libraries and possibly not be used very much? And Scholem described it as redeeming the captives. So let us consider the burning of Jewish books was all the rage by the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Boy Scouts, Yamach Shemo, who, when the Führer became Chancellor of Germany in May 10th of 1933, ordered the conflagration of more than 20,000 Jewish books in the square at Unter den Linden in front of the University of Berlin. The German bibliographer Eliezer Rosenthal of Hanover was accessioned by the University of Amsterdam. Moses Friedland built the Bibliotheca Friedlandica, which was bequeathed by the Asiatic Museum of Imperial University of St. Petersburg. The Russian Jewish Orientalist scholar Baron David Günzburg, 1857 to 1910's library, is known as the Günzburg Collection in Moscow. In the English-speaking world, great Jewish private collections were built by Elkan Adler of London, Meir Sulzberger here in America, Dr. A.S. Rosenbach of Philadelphia, David Kazel, and of course the great Wissenschaft des Judentums scholar Maurice Steinschneider, who Dr. Charles Mannequin has recently released an important volume on, and Jacob Schiff. You may have seen the Schiff Library Classics. Jewish books are more precious than rubies, the bastion of Jewish survival, a survival kit enabling the perpetuation of Jewish existence and religion. And to appreciate the importance of books, let's take Gershom Scholem. In referring to his own library, which he donated posthumously to the JNL in a letter to Agnon, he cites a remark of the Besht, founder of Hasidism, modern Hasidism. He writes, "The Besht says, all of a person's household items, his dwelling and his surroundings, are filled with sparks of his soul and are waiting to be lifted up." This is remarkable from the Besht, being cited by a secular academic. It is the librarian's job, according to Scholem, to raise the sparks of light and the scholar to elevate them. And in the process, a burning fire of light of post-generations of Jews continues to illuminate to the present and into the future, the Sefer becoming a sepulchre that not only can, as Rambam notes, draw one closer to Hashem, but also the bridge, Gesher, between generations, and the historical phenomena of the historical spirit of post-cultural harvests. So there you have Gershom Scholem. Books meant a lot to him. In fact, I would say he lived for books. There are accounts in his letters where he would scour Mea Sharim looking for obscure, rare texts, and it became a kind of archive fever in Derrida's terms, to try to preserve a legacy of remembrance of these texts that the Nazis so eagerly and gung-ho, like eager beavers, tried to stamp out. The sparks of the souls of the wise of old who attempted to transmit their findings of knowledge to future generations by writing their ideas in books presents a challenge to Scholem of raising these sparks. However, once a good reference librarian or scholar has helped prepare access to patrons to these sparks, the conflagration of cognitive illumination shines and grows, nurtured by the librarian and scholar as the Platonic guardian. These are Scholem's words. The glow indeed shines to recuperate the hidden secrets and intellectual treasures of the past, spanning generations, so that we might witness a Hadlika as intense as that on Lag BaOmer at Moroni on the Rashbi's yard site. So you see, here's a secular scholar, Gershom Scholem, who Sfarim meant so much to him. And even though we might say he wasn't an insider as a Mekubal, but rather an academic, objective scholar of the history of Sifrei Kabbalah, he had a great love of books, and that was a Jewish element in his soul that came and was transmitted to him by secular parents, and that the value of education and the reverence for learning still burned on in this secular, acculturated, assimilated family that Scholem came from, and was transmitted nonetheless, even though he was not necessarily a practicing religious halakhic personality. Gershom Scholem, the pioneer of the academic historical study of Sifrei Kabbalah and Mekubalim as an outsider from an academic objective perspective, was good friends with the intellectual Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin went through a horrible divorce, and he describes at the end of it unpacking his library in quasi-mystical terms that Scholem brings down as a Zauberkreis, a magic circle, where he created a space for his palace. Benjamin's 1932 essay, Ich packe mein Bibliothek aus, ein Rede über das Sammeln, is a very important essay on the art of unpacking a library. I'm going to read right now from a Paris review. In 1931, Walter Benjamin wrote a short and now famous essay about readers' relationship to their books. He called it Unpacking My Library, a speech on collecting and learning. And he used the occasion of pulling his almost 3,000 books out of their boxes to muse on the privileges and responsibilities of a reader. Benjamin was moving from the house he had shared with his wife until their acrimonious divorce the previous year to a small apartment in which he would live alone. He said the first time in his life like an adult was when I unpacked my library. Benjamin was then at the threshold of 40 and without any property, position, home, or assets except for these 3,000 books. It might not be entirely mistaken to see his meditation on books as a counterpoise to his breakup of his marriage. The sages comment that in a divorce the altar weeps. Likewise, in the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Haggadah brings down when in 587 Nebuchadnezzar set fire to the first temple, the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. The priests gathered with the keys to the sanctuary, climbed to the burning roof and cried out, Master of the world, since we have not merited to be trustworthy custodians, let the keys be given back to you. They then threw the keys toward heaven. It is told that a hand came out and caught the keys, after which the priests threw themselves into the all-consuming flames. A book and a whole library's books can serve as a key, maftiach, to opening the secrets in Shemaim. So this is Sholem remarking about Benjamin's essay of unpacking his library, a secular Jew. And yet it's bringing also this metaphor of the Rambam, 1135 to 1204, where the Sefer is like a key that can open gates in Shemaim. Alberto Manguel highlights how Benjamin experiences flashbacks as the act of unpacking his books brought memories of recollections and sadness of where and when he acquired these relics in the past, a kind of noetic sketch of his life in collecting and learning books, what in Yiddish is called the process of kinus. Manguel points out, quote, because the library is a place of memory, Benjamin notes that the unpacking of one's books quickly become a mnemonic ritual, not thoughts, but actions. Benjamin writes, but images, memories are conjured up in the process as I recall where I acquired the books and the notes that I wrote in their margins, memories of the cities in which he had found the treasuries, memories of the auction rooms in which he had bought several of them, memories of the past rooms in which his books were kept, memories flooding his mind. The book I take out of a box to which it was consigned in the brief moment before I give it its rightful place turns suddenly in my hands into a token, a keepsake, a relic, from which an entire body can be rebuilt, like DNA. Ernst Hilbert in the Wall Street Journal of April 13th, 2018 writes, Walter Benjamin, quote, wove a spiritual aura around his books, a Zauberkreise, as he prepared to shelve them in a new home. He ruminated about the spring tide of memories which surges toward any collector as he contemplates where and how and what of his possessions as they unfold before his mind in a new context on the shelves, and declared that, quote, the acquisition of an old book is its rebirth. Hilbert reviews 3 books, Albert Manguel, Packing My Library, published by Yale, and Burkhard Spinnin's The Book and Homage by Godini, and 3, Unpacking My Library, edited by Joe Steffens and Matthias Newman, published by Yale. Hilbert writes, quote, as all 3 volumes attest, a book's very presence, combined with its contents, tales, images, and evidence, cast a specific spell on the owner. Books have been written on the status alone of the signed book, Im Chatimah, the loan book, the right book, the burned book, the Talmudim, and even the forbidden books, censored books, and books that can change or end a life, the sorrows of young Goethe, for instance, which caused masses of suicide throughout Germany. Unpacking Benjamin's library in his short-lived monadic life, where he encountered much anti-Semitism in the German university, Benjamin says that he cannot match up and down the ranks of his books he writes, "In Beisen freundliche Horerin Ebenen de Parade Abzunen men," to pass them in review before a friendly audience. The packing of my books and unpacking leaves an expectant mood and floods my memory. Benjamin calls collections of books Physiognomiker der Dingwelt, or the physiognomies of the world, of important godly objects who, once they step into the magic circle Zauberkreise, become readers of the newly owned object's provenance, the whole background for which becomes a magic encyclopedia whose quintessence is the object's fate. End of quote. So I'm giving an idea of book culture, and I could go on. I published extensively about Binyamin in this edition of The Art of the Book Review, Volume 3. And I go on and I surmise Simon Dubnov, who also described in great detail. He was a Bundes about how much his books meant to him. And notably Jewish scholars like Sholem or Simon Dubnov and Salo Baron, Harry Alston Wolfson, Saul Lieberman have described their Sfarim collections in quasi-mystical language. A creative writer like Luis Borges of South America describes imagining heaven itself as a great celestial library in Shemayim. Being without a library by deduction is like being in the opposite place, a place devoid of God's presence. So again, these are examples of secular Jews who were scholars who describe how much books meant to them and what it meant for them to unpack their libraries in their fleeing from Nazi oppression or even just their careers as academics. Another scholar, Alexander Marx, a librarian of the JTS, supervised countless dissertations that he was able to really enhance by knowing where the sparks that could be illuminated and elevated rested in his humongous collection that he built up. His feverish enthusiasm and labor of love to gather and assemble and collect, for instance, every printed edition bearing even an indirect relationship on one's scholarly interests became Marx's lifetime mission. So, the JTS had a terrible fire, and much of Marx's collections was, lost to some degree, but Alexander Marx, who was related to Agnon through marriage, was such a tremendous bibliophile, and I've published a separate paper on Alexander Marx and greatly admire his reverence and cherishing of text and his archive fever to build up the JTS as one of the most important repositories. The bibliophile of a Jewish text is not just someone who owns or possesses books. He or she has a relationship with the text as alive and vibrant as a human relationship. While friends may betray one, a book is not static, but provides further levels of understanding every time the scholar engages it, plumbing different depths of the text's message, so that eventually its contents become a matter of existence outside of the physical printed word, constituting a realm of disembodied intellect. Those are the words of Alexander Marx. Much could be said. I wrote a separate paper in Library Science School on his building up the JTS collection. The distinction between function and essence, between the vessel and its context, became blurred and cognitively coterminous, a triple point, analogously where water exists both as liquid, gas, and solid for the real lover of Jewish books, because the pursuit of gathering them and learning from them brings no one closer to Hashem. It's almost an irrational love. It's a desire without an end to desire, as Goethe's Faust would say. Before payday, Gershom Scholem would allocate funds for buying Sfarim. It's amazing. He was a poor little student in Germany, and his parents sent him a modest allowance as a middle-class family, and Scholem, spent the whole thing on Sfarim. This is how, a lover of books, how important that is to him, even above being nourished. Scholem describes that he wasn't nourished during his university years because he used money that he would have bought potatoes with to buy books. There is the Faustian analogy, but it ends, Lahavdil. The stakes are higher than Faust. It's not selling one's soul to the devil, as Goethe would have it. In Judaism, books are a part of the divine. They are, as the Besh says, sparks of the divine's palace. The quest could pivot on a world redeemed by the attainment of Chokhmah, Bina, Das, or not, and books could play a role in that. Rambam in Hilkot Teshuvah notes in Olam Haba, the tzaddikim sit with crowns on the heads, enjoying the Ziv Shechina. What are the crowns on the heads? The Chokhmah, Bina, Das gained in this world, when books can play an important role in that crown formation and foundation, and therefore the stakes are very high. Now, we're going to mention Jonathan Rose, who is an important scholar of censorship by the Nazis of Jewish books, who writes that the mass slaughter of Jews was accompanied by the most devastating literary holocaust of all times. In Nazi Germany, less than 5 months after the Fuhrer became Chancellor of Germany, on the eve of May 10th, 1933, he ordered the Hitler Jugend, the Boy Scouts, Yamach Shemo, to make a great conflagration of 25,000 Jewish books in the square at Unter den Linden in front of University of Berlin. Like wildflower, book burnings were staged throughout Germany and Austria, which were a prelude to the burning of the synagogues on Kristallnacht, which took place on November 9th, 1938, and was named a birthday party, a Geburtstag Schanken zu Namen Martin Luther. For you see, Martin Luther in Die Shema Mefrash and the Juden in the Lugen had already said that the Jews' books should be rounded up and burned, with Jews burned as well in their synagogues. And in fact, the brown shirts chose Kristallnacht as Geburtstag Schanken zu Namen Martin Luther. That is to say, they very carefully chose that date as the anniversary of his death. In Munich, you had massive burnings, what was called Einladung zum Verbrennungsakt am Königsplatz. And you find these billboards all over Germany that led eventually to the gassing and burning of Jews, was preluded by the burning of books. Unfortunately, thousands of incidents like the one in Berlin and elsewhere, Munich, of book burnings occurred. An important source is Chaim Kaplan's Scroll of Agony, a diary account of the Warsaw Ghetto, which is regarding the destruction of Jewish libraries under the Nazis, radical acts of censorship. Rabbi Poznansky was the rabbi of the Tolomaki Synagogue in Warsaw, the largest population of Jews in Eastern Europe, rivaling Vilna and Minsk. Rabbi Poznansky served as the head librarian and was an important scholar of the Tekufa of the Gaonim. Rabbi Poznansky served as a librarian of this synagogue, which had a humongous collection of Hebraica, which under the Poznansky grew to a collection of 40,000 Sfarim and manuscripts, including many rare. At first the library was in a number of rooms, but then it expanded to a whole separate building. Despite Solomon Schechter's invitation to Rabbi Poznansky to join JTS faculty to become its librarian in 1902, Poznansky refused to abandon his congregation in Warsaw. The destruction of the library is depicted in the Warsaw Ghetto diary of Chaim Kaplan, which I urge you to read, the Scroll of Agony. I quote just a little excerpt. The day before yesterday, October 23rd, true vandals, like conqueror crusaders, entered the Talmudic library, where rare spiritual treasures were stored. They removed the valuable books and manuscripts, put them on trucks, and took them to some unknown place. This is a burning of the soul of Polish Jewry, for this library was our spiritual sanctuary. It was our soul. That's powerful words by Chaim Kaplan. Systematically, the Nazis sought to burn and confiscate Hebraica and Judaica. Kahat recounts the news heard about the Nazi destruction of the Kahat Library in Vienna by writing, I can remember clearly the day a letter arrived from Vienna telling me that the Nazis had burned the books of the Kahat Foundation there in Vienna. In my distress, I turned to Professor Alexander Marx, who rushed to my home as soon as he received the call. Words cannot describe Professor Marx's grief. He was in tears. Each one of the books of the Kohat library was like a treasured friend, according to Marx. The loss was irreparable and irreplaceable. And now I quote from, you can find my footnotes in some of these books that I brought out on censorship and other topics in Judaica science, library science. So this is what's written by, I think, Gershom Scholem. As Nazi hordes took over occupied lands in a campaign of pillage, robbery, confiscation, and rape, Einsatzgruppen mass murder of Jews, the Nazis set aside some Jewish books for a future museum to the murdered Jewish race. Remember, Judaism is a religion, not a race. Jacob Katz brings that out beautifully in his book, Persecution, Pride and Persecution. After World War II, this collection of Hebrew books at the Offenbach Depot was confiscated by the Allies, and the scholar Scholem was sent to salvage and bring back to the Jewish National Library in Israel precious tomes, referring to his work as Redemption of the Captives. Prior to the Holocaust, Marx of the JTS anticipated the destruction, so in 1930s the rescue of European Jewish treasures was sought. The transfer of ritual objects and Sifrei Torah of the Danzig Jewish community to the seminary in 1939 is documented by the Jewish Museum. You can even see the Danzig Aron Kodesh there in their museum. Schmelzer cites a letter of Dr. Israel Shapiro to Marx as follows. I take this opportunity of bringing to your attention a proposal of Leo Vince, former editor of Ost and West in Berlin, and now a resident of Tel Aviv. Mr. Vince, in a letter recently received, states that the Jewish Library of Vienna was burned by the Nazis, and that other great Jewish libraries and cultural collections in the Reich stood in similar danger. Mr. Vince suggests that such valuable collections as those in the Rabbinical Seminary at Breslau, the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentum, and the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin, as well as the Library of Jüdische Gemeinde in Berlin, could be ransomed for a moderate sum and brought to this country or to Palestine, what today is Israel, Baruch Hashem. He cites the German need for foreign exchange as a probable inducement for the Nazis parting with these Sfarim collections at a reasonable figure, and thinks a committee should be formed in this country to collect the monies. I do not know whether you have already been approached on this matter or you thought it practicable. In the former Soviet Union, to shift our focus to another country, many decades there was ban on printing, distributing, and owning Jewish books. As Rabbi Yitzhak Zilber notes in his book To Remain a Jew, learning Hebrew and rabbinic texts had to take place in secret. During the Stalin regime, the purge of Jewish intellectuals, poets, and writers and philosophers who were often murdered or sent to Siberia also involved the confiscation of Jewish literary treasures. So in these books that I brought out on Judaica librarianship, I include particularly my grandmother's first cousin's husband, Dr. Aryeh Vilsker, who played an important role in keeping alive the flame of Jewish academic scholarship by doing a lot of things, including finding unknown poems of Rabbi Yehuda Levi. He was the son-in-law of Rav Menachem Mendel Gluskin Zatal, who was the Ab Bet Din of Perichi and Minsk and later St. Petersburg. And I've given a description of Rav Gluskin and his family back through the Maharal in my 7th volume titled The Gluskin Family History. To return to Schmelzer. The salvage efforts were not undertaken, and it is not known, according to Schmelzer, what steps, if in any, were taken by the JTS or other organizations in detail. In the post-World War II aftermath, the Jewish Cultural Reconstructionist Organization, headed by Salo Baron, History of World History of the Jews, Social History and Religious History of the Jews, and administered by Hannah Arendt, was responsible for the distribution of many thousands of Judaica and Hebraica works, looted by the Nazis and recovered after the war from the Offenbach warehouse, intended to serve as a stockpile to the Museum of the Murdered Jewish Race. Schmelzer quotes 1955 librarian Gerson Cohn, Dr. Cohn, who reports that 28,000 volumes arrived in the library in just 1 year. Schmelzer thus deduces that it was no wonder that in 1958, the librarian Nachum Sarna Dr. Sarna referred to 55,000 uncatalogued books, an equal number of tomes in need of binding and backlog cataloging. So, a tremendous amount was recuperated, but so much more was lost. And that is a great, great sadness of the Nazis' censorship. And I tried to show in some of these lectures that the history of censorship of Jewish books is not new. And that, in fact, the Nazis were very clever. They understood that the lifeblood and vitality of the Jewish people was from learning, lumdus, and in part that can come through, particularly after the age of the printing press, through books. An autodidact, who take Sharansky in prison. He learned Hebrew, and somebody gave him a copy of Tehillim. I think it was his wife from Israel, who was a Rav Kooknik follower, and as an autodidact, he still carries around his Sefer Tehillim to this day, and look at all the good he's done, and how tremendous as an autodidact that link of learning Tehillim, Sefer Tehillim in prison was. And so I think what we see from this lecture number 3 is that the reverence, cherishing, and love of Jewish books, yes, is primarily in its most exalted form found in the rabbinic traditions, multi-millennia transmission of a Masorah. But even in those secular Jews, like Gershom Scholem, like Sharansky, like the Jews in Russia who went into underground at risk of their lives to own a Hebrew book and to have Jewish book discussion groups, even these secular Jews had the spark of love for text and cherishing and reverence for tradition and Jewish culture and the importance of Jewish education. And we shouldn't underwrite the secular community for not having a tincture of this love for text. And I tried to show from the outset of my lecture tonight that people like Oppenheim and the other great collectors of texts that were later assimilated into collections like the Oxford Bodleian or the St. Petersburg Library, the Furkovich collection, and many others who gathered such important stashes of Hebraica and Judaica, Hyman Michael and David Kaufman, Abraham Metzbacher, to name a few. These secular lovers of Jewish text, we also owe a debt of gratitude, and we should not forget their dedication to transmitting Jewish culture to future generations for their cherishing of the written text. And today we've lost so much of that with social media and the visualization of culture. In the prehistorical period when cavemen doodled on the walls of caves in cartoon-like fashion, I fear often that we're being returned to an era that has negative tolerance for even going through a Bildungsroman. Like when I was in college, I took a whole course on Dostoevsky and Henry James and other great novelists like Stendhal in French. The courses were taught in French on Stendhal and Victor Hugo, and I took courses in French on L'Âge de Classicisme of Molière, Racine, and Corneille. And these courses required, basically, if you took a history course, you were going to sit and read tremendous amounts of text, maybe 10 hours a day. Today, students often don't have the Sitzfleisch to do this, and we're moving towards a visual culture of video and social media and glitzy images of PowerPoints and so forth. And so much is lost when we lose this ability to sit and work through texts. Dostoevsky's The Underground Man, or the Grand Inquisitor chapter of Crime and Punishment, and other great novelists. It's so unfortunate that people just don't have the patience for this anymore, because time itself is being reduced to a soundbite, the quick fix, fast food, and just a news bite. And when that happens, great evil rises up, because reporting can shrink to a causality shrinks to a reporting. Shia Leibowitz, as I mentioned in my first lecture, he was very concerned that causality shrinks to a reporting. And he cites Rambam's notion of the four causes of Aristotle, that the Kiddush cup is made out of silver, the material cause, and the formal cause is the shape, and the efficient cause is the silversmith, and the teleological cause reciting Kiddush. But now in the age of instant messaging, it's even worse than sensational journalism, because velocities of change can escalate a military confrontation, particularly if you get bad intelligence. In the Middle Ages, if things were to happen militarily, you had to send out a pigeon with a note on its foot, or a horseback person with a message that they carried. Shakespeare's tragedies are often, the horseback people are like ships passing in the night, and the messages just don't get delivered in time. But now, when things and velocities of change are at dizzying pace, because I can push a button on my machine and email somebody across the globe, great danger arises on the horizon when causality shrinks to a reporting. And that is one of the great things we've lost in a culture that does not have the Sitzfleisch to go through long texts. I was in a discipline of philosophy which writes very concisely, like poetry, short tractates generally. But historians need to be able to go through volumes of archival material and volumes of secondary sources. And without a tolerance to appreciating and revering text, so much will be lost. The I-it relationship will prevail, which is the relationship I have with a computer. Is nothing but magnets and electricity and plastic. But the relationship I have with a person is an I-thou relationship. It can do, according to Buber. And so too, something that is a sacred text, like Rambam's Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, or even more sacred still, the Bavli, that is an I-thou relationship. And that's, I hope you gained a sense of that from my lecture too. And we lose so much in the age of the soundbite, the quick fix, where people think that at the click of the mouse, I've finished my assignment. Little do they know they have not even begun their assignment. They have not uncovered all the sources. Things fall through the web, so to speak. And not only that, the skills of critical analysis and thinking, noesis, gnosis, the understanding of understanding, getting to the depths and roots, whether it be an etymological or genealogical method, or whatever method. So much is lost when we don't have tolerance for text anymore, and we move to visual culture, which eclipses the word. And I hope you get a sense from these lectures on the censorship of Jewish books. Really, there's a great risk and danger on the horizon that not only our culture will be dumbed down by an intolerance of being able to sit with a text like the Talmud. This is not read like a newspaper. Nietzsche once mentioned that in the Middle Ages, in his personal tradition, his father was a Protestant clergyman, his ancestors woke up every morning and studied sacred Latin texts of religious sort. And now, what does the person wake up and do? They look at the newspaper, primarily for the sports page or sensationalized stories. And what do they do with the newspaper? Nietzsche says they use it to clean up the dog's mess. So we are losing so much in an age where the word has become disposable. The rabbis and the Sanskrit tradition, for that matter, of the Brahmins and their priests, and the Confucian tradition, and the Jewish tradition, and the Islamic medieval tradition for beautiful illuminated texts, and the Christian monk tradition of preserved works of botany and all sorts of great learning. We are at great risk in this technological revolution that we are living through, where we don't understand the cherishing love and reference for sacred texts And from this lecture 3, I hope you see that even secular Jews, they have sparks in their souls for reverence and cherishing. Maybe not for sacred texts, but for Jewish culture, Jewish tradition, and Jewish learning from an academic, objective standpoint. I thank you very much for the chance to appear. I thank Rabbi Weisblum and Alida Portnoy for this chance, and I thank all of you for your patience in your interest and your dedication in storing up this memory to an age where the text was revered, loved, and cherished. I thank Rabbi Weisblum again, who I've known for over 18 years, for this chance to appear. The future lectures that we can look forward to are on the censorship of the Talmud, which is an immense, immense subject. And we have many other periods in Jewish history to enumerate and detail on the censorship of the Hebrew text. And I look forward to sharing with you in the future more about the censorship of Judaica in Hebraica. Thank you so much. Toda Rabbah, ala chesed shekamaltuka aleinu.